I do not know whether to make my statement because it has already been made by so many of the speakers who have spoken here. But ladies and gentlemen, today is the 9th day of March 2026. I do not say this because I imagine you do not know what day it is. I say it because I want there to be no doubt about the significance of this moment. Years from now, we will look back on this day as a turning point in the journey of our nation's transformation. Today I have signed into law the National Infrastructure Fund. For too long, Kenya has been a nation of great ambition without the financial resources to match it. We have known that what we must build, including roads, railways, ports, power, housing, and irrigation, yet too often, the means to achieve them remained beyond our reach. But Kenya has never been a nation defined by limitation. The generations before us fought for independence, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Because of them, we live under one of the most progressive, democratic, and open societies in the world. Our Constitution guarantees healthcare, housing, food, water, education, and social security as fundamental rights, but rights written on paper must be delivered in reality. That conviction gave rise to the bottom-up economic transformation agenda, the belief that our nationhood remains incomplete as so long as millions are excluded from economic opportunity. Over the past 3 years, we have laid a stronger foundation for our country, restoring macroeconomic stability, revitalizing agriculture, expanding healthcare, stabilizing education, advancing affordable housing while creating jobs, increasing our savings, deepening financial inclusion, and opening new opportunities for our young people. Today, Kenya stands on firmer ground, but the next stage of our journey demands more skill, more investment, more infrastructure, and above all, a new way to finance our development. The National Infrastructure Fund is a commitment we made to the Kenyan people in our manifesto. Today, we fulfill that promise. But why did we propose the National Infrastructure Fund in the first place? Because of the scale of the challenge before us, there is need for a new approach. Multilateral development institutions estimate that Africa faces an infrastructure financing gap of up to $80 billion every year. That is, the continent requires about between 130 and 170 billion dollars for infrastructure development every year. Kenya and our infrastructure needs reflects that very reality. Every meeting, in every part of Kenya, the conversation is about this road and the other road. Electricity connection to this village and to that town. Connectivity in different parts of the country. And access to agricultural infrastructure for food security. Every meeting in every part of Kenya speaks to those issues. The World Bank has estimated that our country requires approximately $4 billion each year to meet its infrastructure needs. A decade ago, Africa, Kenya included, believed it had found a once-in-a-generation opportunity to accelerate infrastructure development. Global interest rates were historically low following the global financial crisis. The China's Belt and Road Initiative opened new sources of infrastructure financing. But we did not fully anticipate the risks of relying so heavily on sovereign debt. And certainly, none of us could have foreseen the shocks that would soon follow: the COVID-19 pandemic and the global economic and financial turbulence that came in its wake. It was against this backdrop that my team and I began to ask ourselves a necessary question before the last election. We spent a lot of time a year before the last election, and we asked ourselves, how would Kenya continue investing in the infrastructure required for our development, while at the same time stabilizing our economy, responding to all the other challenges that come with it, and navigating the aftershocks of pandemics? We knew that a period of fiscal discipline would be unavoidable, but we also knew that halting development was not an option. I remember this very clearly when I sat with David Ndii, who I'm sure is in our midst here, and Hassan, who is here, discussing how we are going to do things differently. That was 1 year before the last election. And we sat under a tree and we were discussing. They are much more knowledgeable than me in those matters. They schooled me in some of the items. But as Mbadi said, I am also a fast learner. That is where the idea of the National Infrastructure Fund was born. I couldn't put it much more clearly and succinctly than it is stated in our manifesto. And I want to quote for you. This is a manifesto written 4 years ago. An infrastructure fund, I quote, will be established with initial capitalization from privatization proceeds, with a view to progressively reducing financing of commercially viable infrastructure projects from the budget, end of quote. Today, we are doing exactly that. The National Infrastructure Fund is here, and tomorrow in the morning at 8, I will be at the NSC to ring the bell to complete the privatization of the Kenya Pipeline IPO and raise 106 billion Kenya shillings that will be the seed money for the National Infrastructure Fund. It looks too exact to be real, but that is what it is. We would have moved earlier, but as many of you know, our privatization initiatives encountered some headwinds. Around the same time, we sought to expand, for example, the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport through a public-private partnership. That proposal also met very strong resistance. Today, I am pleased to announce that the expansion of the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport will be the first major project financed through this new model of financing under the National Infrastructure Fund. Just so that you know, and again, it looks too exact to be real, but that is what it is. We would have moved earlier, but as many of you know, our privatization initiatives encountered some headwinds. Around the same time, we sought to expand, for example, the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport through a public-private partnership. That proposal also met very strong resistance. Today, I am pleased to announce that the expansion of the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport will be the first major project financed through this new model of financing under the National Infrastructure Fund. Just so that you know, and again, it looks too exact to be real, We just announced the contract for the expansion of Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. Between 15 and 20 billion shillings from the National Infrastructure Fund, from the proceeds of the Kenya Pipeline IPO, will go to financing the seed money for the expansion of Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. We will put in our 15 or 20 billion, pension funds, insurance companies, other collectives. You have the opportunity to invest. We are not talking about next year. We are not talking about in August. The opportunity to work with us in the National Infrastructure Fund is as soon as next month. So the opportunities you have been looking for to invest in commercially viable public infrastructure projects is right here. And our skin as government will be the first one in the game. You will come, and then others will come. As Kili said, this is one of the things they told me when I first appeared at the Nairobi Securities Exchange. It's taken a bit of time, Mr. Kili, but now we are here. See you in the game. The potential for domestic capital is immense. You've just heard the numbers. We have 2.81 trillion of Kenyan money that is available from our pensions and our other collectives. This is money, patient money, that can be used for our national development. Pension money is for pensioners, but pensioners have children. We've been told here by my good friend, the CEO of Africa Finance Corporation, we must use pensions to create jobs for the children of those whose pensions we are managing. That's what he told us. You know, that money must work for the pensioners. It must work for their children. And we now have the structure. We now have the plan to make sure that we channel those resources in the right direction. Make sure that it earns a returns for the pensioners, but also supports our national development. Last year alone, Kenyan pension funds assets grew by 700 billion shillings, representing a 25% increase, bringing total pension assets to 2.81 trillion. In 2023, as Kili said, it was 1.6 trillion. Look at the growth. It's growing by 700 billion every year. It will not be possible for you to invest that money in treasury bills or treasury bonds. We have to look for new asset classes for us. And I want to ask the people in that space to begin to think about new asset classes and to eliminate restrictions that are put on pension money to invest in other asset classes that gives a return, but also helps grow the nation and grow the economy. The annual growth of 700 billion shillings, equivalent to roughly $5.3 billion, exceeds the World Bank's estimate of our total annual infrastructure financing requirement. The National Infrastructure Fund provides a mechanism to channel these long-term savings directly into infrastructure investments. Mobilizing domestic capital will help us solve three major challenges that arise when development depends excessively on foreign financing. The first challenge it will help us solve is the mismatch of investment horizon. Infrastructure projects are long-term assets. Whether you talk about highways, toll roads, energy, and rail, these are long-term infrastructure. They are viable, they are commercially viable, but their gestation period is longer. Look at what we did with the SGR. We took facilities of 15 years and 20 years. That is why it almost crushed us. Now we have an opportunity to, under the National Infrastructure Fund, to crowd in resources with a long-term view and make those infrastructure projects work for the people investing and for the nation, and make them commercially viable. The second issue that this will help us solve is the cost of capital. Many analysts have shown that Africa consistently pays more for capital than objective risk would justify. In infrastructure financing, the default rate in Africa is approximately 5.5%, compared to 14.5% in Latin America. But you know what? International investors typically demand returns that are about 5 percentage points higher in Africa than in Latin America. Just look at the unfairness. Our default rate is 5.5%. In Latin America, it is 14.5%. Yet, when we go to the market, we are told we are much more risky investment destination than Latin America. Where is the sense? Where is the fairness? And that is precisely what this National Infrastructure Fund is going to solve. This perception bias alone is estimated to cost the continent up to $4 billion each year in additional interest payments. Payments we shouldn't be making. If we apply Kenya's share of Africa's Eurobond exposure, roughly 8%, that perception penalty costs us approximately $320 million every year. That is 42 billion shillings every year that we are paying more than we should be paying merely because we have a perception penalty. The National Infrastructure Fund will erase that perception penalty because we will be mobilizing our resources from here. And nobody is going to tell us about a risk that does not crystallize. The third challenge is currency mismatch. When infrastructure is financed in foreign currency while the revenues are earned in Kenya shillings, exchange rate volatility introduces significant risk. This challenge has long affected many of our utilities. Many of you remember the challenges Kenya Power goes through all the time. Domestic financing helps eliminate this currency exposure. As I said, tomorrow morning, I will ring the bell to inaugurate trading of the Kenya pipeline on the Nairobi Securities Exchange, fulfilling a commitment I made 3 years ago. Kenya Pipeline Company IPO has generated 106 billion shillings that will be used to capitalize the National Infrastructure Fund. Our goal is to leverage this capital at least 12 times, mobilizing up to 1.2 trillion shillings for infrastructure investment. Over time, this model will enable Kenya to mobilize close to 5 trillion shillings in infrastructure investments over the next decade. And that is why all of us are talking about over the next generation. Previously, this asset would have provided the National Treasury with a dividend of about 5 billion shillings annually. That's exactly what John Mbadi was saying. This asset of Kenya Pipeline, we would be receiving a dividend of 5 billion shillings every year. But look at what it is going to do. The maximization of this mature asset is going to do maybe 20, 30 times what the 5 billion shillings would do for us every year. And that is the genius in rearranging and reorganizing our resources in a manner that it works best and we maximize their output and benefit and create much more impact than it currently is creating. Through the National Infrastructure Fund, that value of 5 billion will now be multiplied many times over, delivering infrastructure that will benefit all the people of Kenya. I must confess that I struggle to understand the argument that using infrastructure assets to finance additional infrastructure somehow amounts to selling the family silver. I don't understand how that logic is. On the contrary, it is the responsible stewardship of national assets for national development. Many of you will also be aware that Parliament recently enacted the Government-Owned Enterprises Act. This legislation provides modern legal framework for commercializing government enterprises and ensuring that they operate according to the highest standard of corporate governance. This is what our friends from the banks were telling us. I want to assure you that the National Infrastructure Fund and all the other government-owned enterprises, we have made a decision that these assets will be, these parastatals and government agencies will be run on the same principles as the private sector, if not higher. That is our commitment. We have made the decision that these commercially viable agencies and enterprises will not be run by people with political connection. They will not be run by politicians who have not succeeded in their quest. They will not be run by people who have not been subjected to competitive recruitment. This is how we are going to change how Kenya delivers on the most critical and priority programs. This legislation provides a modern, as I said, framework for us to work with the private sector. Institutions such as the Kenya Airports Authority, Kenya Ports Authority, Kenya Railways, KETRACO, the Geothermal Development Company, the National Cereals and Produce Board will now operate under this framework, among others. Over time, these entities will access capital markets, and the proceeds will allow us to build even more infrastructure for the future. The law establishing the National Infrastructure Fund also provides strong governance safeguards. It establishes a governing council responsible for strategic oversight, strengthens the professionalism and independence of the fund's board, and ensures parliamentary oversight in its investment policy to guarantee transparency, accountability, and the prudent stewardship of public resources. Finally, let me emphasize that the National Infrastructure Fund is not an experiment. It is a model that has been adopted successfully around the world.